Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Working the North Slope oil fields in Alaska isn't for everyone. The isolation gets to you after a while. Nothing but white tundra and frozen darkness for months on end. I'd been doing pipeline maintenance up near Prudhoe Bay for about 6 years when this happened, February 2018. The money was good, real good, which is why guys like me, Brad, and Tommy kept coming back season after season. We were a tight crew, had each other's backs through blizzards and equipment failures that could kill you faster than you could radio for help. That particular rotation, we'd just finished a week-long repair job on a section of pipe that had developed stress fractures from the constant freeze-thaw cycles. The company put us up in one of those prefab shelters about 40 miles south of Deadhorse, right off the Dalton Highway. You know, that ice road the truckers use. The drive back should have been routine. We'd done it 100 times before in Brad's modified Ford F-350, the kind with chains on all 4 tires and enough heating to keep you from turning into a popsicle. Tommy was sprawled across the back seat, catching up on sleep while I rode shotgun, keeping Brad company as he navigated through what was shaping up to be a decent snowstorm. Visibility was maybe 30 feet on a good stretch. The headlights just bounced off the swirling snow, creating this hypnotic tunnel of white that made you feel like you were flying through space. We were about 2 hours into the drive when Brad suddenly hit the brakes hard enough to throw Tommy into the back of my seat. Through the windshield, barely visible in the storm, was a figure stumbling along the side of the road. No vehicle in sight, no emergency lights, just this person in what looked like a heavy parka, moving in that desperate, uncoordinated way people do when hypothermia starts setting in. Brad pulled over immediately. You don't leave anyone out in that kind of weather. Not when it's 40 below and getting worse. Tommy jerked awake, cursing about the sudden stop, but shut up quick when he saw what we were looking at. The 3 of us sat there for maybe 5 seconds, watching this guy struggle through knee-deep snow about 20 yards ahead. His parka was one of those old military surplus ones, olive green with fur trim around the hood that kept whipping around in the wind. What struck me as odd right away was how he was walking. Not the stumbling gait of someone fighting the cold, but this mechanical, repetitive motion, like he was following a track only he could see. Brad honked the horn twice, but the guy didn't even turn his head. Just kept moving forward, one foot after the other, arms hanging loose at his sides. Jesus Christ, he's gonna die out there, Tommy said, already reaching for his door handle. Brad threw the truck in park and we all piled out, the wind hitting us like 1,000 tiny knives. Even with our heavy gear, the cold tried to crawl through every gap, every zipper. We started jogging toward the guy, calling out, our voices getting swallowed by the storm. When we got within 10 feet, Brad grabbed his shoulder to turn him around, and that's when things got weird. The man's face was pale. I mean paper white, but not frostbitten. His eyes were this cloudy gray color, like dirty ice, and they seemed to look right through us. He had maybe 3 days of stubble, dark against that unnatural white skin, and his lips were moving constantly, forming words we couldn't hear over the wind. But it was the scar that made Brad take a step back, a jagged line running from his left temple down to his jaw, the kind of mark that tells you someone survived something they probably shouldn't have. Sir, are you okay?" Tommy shouted, waving his hand in front of the man's face. No response. The guy just stood there, swaying slightly, those cloudy eyes fixed on something beyond us, beyond the storm, beyond everything. His lips never stopped moving, and when I leaned in closer, fighting every instinct telling me to back away, I could just make out what he was repeating. 247, 247, 247, over and over like a broken record. Brad and Tommy exchanged looks. We'd all heard stories about people going crazy from the isolation up here, but this was different. This felt wrong on a level I couldn't explain. We had to get him in the truck, though. Ethics aside, leaving him would mean explaining a frozen corpse to the state troopers, and none of us needed that paperwork. It took all three of us to guide him to the ford. He didn't resist, but he didn't help either. Just let us move him like a mannequin, his body stiff and cold even through the parka. The weird thing was, he didn't shiver. You spend enough time in the Arctic, you know that shivering is your body's last defense against the cold. When that stops, you're in trouble. But this guy, his skin was ice cold and he wasn't shivering at all. We got him in the back with Tommy, who pressed himself against the far door like he was trying to phase through it. Brad cranked the heat to maximum and pulled back onto the Dalton. For about 10 minutes, nobody said anything. The only sounds were the heater fan on full blast and those lips still moving, still forming those same numbers. Then Tommy cleared his throat and said what we were all thinking. "Guys, doesn't he look like that missing snowmobiler from a couple years back? The one they found the sled but never the body?" Brad's knuckles went white on the steering wheel. I remembered that story. Everyone who worked the slope did. February 2016, a local guy named Christopher Vaughn went missing during a solo snowmobile trip. They found his sled wrapped around a tree about 15 miles from where we picked up our passenger, blood on the seat, drag marks leading into the woods that just stopped. Search teams looked for 2 weeks before calling it. In that kind of cold, without shelter, you've got maybe a few hours. They declared him dead, had a memorial service and everything. His brother worked for one of the drilling companies, used to drink at the same bar in Deadhorse. Said Christopher had that exact scar from a childhood accident with a boat propeller. The more I looked at our silent passenger in the rearview mirror, the more my gut churned. Same scar, same face shape, even the same color eyes. Though Christopher's had been brown in the photos, not this milky gray. The shelter appeared through the storm like a metal oasis, its yellow lights barely penetrating the white wall of snow. We radioed ahead but got nothing but static, which wasn't unusual in weather like this. The building was one of those modular units the oil companies scatter along the pipeline route, basically a reinforced shipping container with bunks, a kitchenette, and a communication setup. Brad parked as close to the door as possible, and we prepared to move our passenger inside. That's when he spoke for the first time, his voice gravelly and wrong, like someone talking through water. "Can't go in. Not yet. Not until 2:47. Tommy actually jumped, banging his head on the doorframe, but we weren't leaving anyone in the truck to freeze regardless of what they wanted. It took Brad bear-hugging him from behind, while Tommy and I each took an arm, but we managed to get him through the door. The second we crossed the threshold, he went completely limp, dead weight that nearly took us all to the floor. We laid him on one of the bottom bunks, and Brad went to check the radio while Tommy put water on for coffee. I stayed with our guest, checking his pulse, slow but steady, and trying to make sense of what we'd found. Up close, under the harsh fluorescent lights, more details jumped out. His fingernails were way too long, curved and yellowish, like he hadn't cut them in months. There was no smell though, which bothered me more than it should have. Someone who'd been wandering the wilderness should reek of sweat, body odor, something. But there was nothing, just this neutral, almost sterile absence of scent. His parka pockets were empty except for a single item that made my chest tighten, a snowmobile key on a leather fob, the kind they sold at the Dead Horse gas station. The leather was cracked and weathered, and branded into it was C. Vaughn 2015. Tommy came back with the coffee and saw me holding the key. His face went pale, and he set the mugs down so hard coffee sloshed everywhere. "That's not possible," he whispered, but we both knew it was right there in my hand. Brad came back from the radio room shaking his head. Storm was interfering with everything. We were stuck until it passed, probably another 8 to 10 hours. That's when the power flickered. Just once, but enough to make us all look up at the ceiling. These shelters had backup generators that kicked in automatically, so power issues were rare. The lights steadied, but something had changed in the room. Our passenger's eyes were open, staring directly at the clock on the wall. 11:30 p.m. His lips started moving again, faster this time, that same mantra. 2:47. Tommy grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Right now, storm or no storm." But Brad was already shaking his head, pointing at the window where the snow was coming down so thick you couldn't see the truck parked 10 feet away. We were trapped, and somewhere deep in my lizard brain, I had the feeling that was exactly what was supposed to happen. The next few hours crawled by like molasses. We took turns watching our visitor while trying to maintain some pretense of normalcy. Brad made sandwiches nobody ate. Tommy cleaned his tools for the third time. I kept checking the weather outside, hoping for any sign of a break. The man never moved from the bunk, just lay there with his eyes locked on that clock, lips moving in their endless countdown. Around 2 a.m., exhaustion hit us hard. Tommy volunteered for first watch while Brad and I grabbed bunks on the opposite side of the room. I didn't think I'd sleep, but the adrenaline crash knocked me out cold. I woke to Tommy shaking me violently, his eyes wide with panic. The clock read 2:46 a.m. Brad was already up, standing by the door with a wrench in his hand. "He's gone," Tommy gasped. I just looked away for a second to check the coffee pot, and when I turned back, the bunk was empty. We searched the shelter, all 40 feet of it, but there was nowhere to hide. The man had simply vanished. That's when we heard it. 3 deliberate knocks on the metal door. Slow, measured. The kind of knock that says someone knows exactly what they're doing. 2:47 a.m. The knocking came again, this time from the window on the north wall, then the south window, then back to the door. It circled the shelter like something was walking around outside, testing each entrance. Brad gripped the wrench tighter. "That's impossible," he said. "Nobody could survive out there without gear." But we all knew our visitor hadn't exactly been normal. The knocking stopped at 2:48, leaving us in a silence so complete it felt like pressure in our ears. We stayed frozen like that until dawn, nobody willing to be the first to move. When the storm finally broke around 7 a.m., we made a discovery that sent us racing for the truck. There were no footprints anywhere around the shelter. Not leading away from the door, not under the windows, nothing. The snow was pristine, untouched, but Tommy never made it to the truck. When Brad and I turned around, he was just gone. No sound, no struggle, no tracks. Just empty air where he'd been standing 2 seconds before. We tore out of there and didn't stop until we hit Fairbanks. Filed a missing person report. Told them about picking up the stranger. Left out the part about him possibly being Christopher Vaughn. The troopers found Tommy's body 3 days later, 15 miles from the shelter in the exact spot where Vaughn's snowmobile had crashed. Frozen solid, lips blue, with drag marks in the snow that just stopped. The nights at mile 237 fuel stops stretched endlessly, each one bleeding into the next until time lost all meaning. I'd been there since early November, manning the counter while Arctic winds rattled the windows and 18-wheelers rolled past like ghosts on the Dalton Highway. The job paid well enough for a college student trying to save money, and the owner, an old guy named Eugene, didn't ask too many questions when I needed extra shifts. Most nights passed without incident. Truckers grabbing coffee, locals filling up their tanks, maybe the occasional tourist who'd gotten turned around in the storm. The station itself wasn't much to write home about. 2 pumps out front, a small convenience store stocked with overpriced snacks, and a bathroom that barely functioned when the pipes weren't frozen solid. Everything changed on my 3rd Wednesday there. The clock had just hit 2 a.m. when I noticed headlights cutting through the blizzard outside. An old Chevy pickup, rust eating through its blue paint job, pulled up to pump number 4 and just stopped. The driver didn't get out, didn't reach for his wallet, didn't even turn off the engine. He just sat there, visible only as a dark silhouette through the frost-covered windshield. After about 10 minutes, I figured maybe he was having car trouble or had fallen asleep. But when I grabbed my jacket to go check on him, the truck suddenly reversed and disappeared back into the storm. Strange, sure, but in a place like that, Strange was relative. I made a note in the logbook and went back to restocking the energy drinks, figuring that would be the end of it. The following Wednesday arrived with another blizzard, worse than the last one. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, and the wind made the whole building creak like an old ship. Eugene had warned me about nights like these, said sometimes the weather got so bad that even the truckers would hunker down rather than risk the highway. I was counting inventory in the back room, trying to stay busy, when I heard the familiar rumble of an engine outside. The clock on the wall showed exactly 2:00 a.m. Through the security monitor, I watched that same blue Chevy pull up to pump 4, same spot as before, and the driver did the exact same thing. Absolutely nothing. This time I got a better angle on the camera, could make out more details. The man wore what appeared to be a heavy winter coat with the hood up, and his hands gripped the steering wheel at precisely 10 and 2. He never adjusted his position, never reached for the radio, never even seemed to breathe. I let it go on for 15 minutes this time before deciding to approach him. The moment I stepped toward the door, keys in hand, the truck's reverse lights flared to life. By the time I pushed through the wind and snow to reach pump 4, nothing remained but tire tracks already being erased by the storm. The whole thing left me unsettled in a way I couldn't quite explain. There was something mechanical about his movements, or lack thereof, like watching a video on loop. I spent the rest of my shift jumping at every set of headlights that passed, but the blue Chevy didn't return. When Eugene came in for the morning shift, I mentioned it to him, trying to keep my tone casual. He just shrugged and said, "We got all kinds out here, especially during storm season." But I noticed he avoided making eye contact when he said it, and his fingers drummed nervously on the counter. By the third Wednesday, I'd prepared myself. I'd even switched shifts with Jasmine specifically to be there at 2 a.m., though I didn't tell her the real reason. The security system at the station was ancient but functional, a setup from the early 2000s that recorded everything on a loop, overwriting footage after 7 days. I'd figured out how to save clips to a USB drive, and I had one ready in my pocket. The storm that night was lighter, just steady snow instead of a full blizzard, which meant better visibility. I positioned myself behind the counter with a clear view of pump 4, pretending to read a magazine while I waited. At 1:58 a.m., I heard it, that distinctive engine rumble growing louder as it approached from the north. The blue Chevy materialized from the darkness like it had been summoned, pulling into the exact same spot with practiced precision. This time, I was ready with the camera controls, zooming in as close as the old system would allow. What I saw made my skin crawl. The man in the driver's seat wasn't just still, he was impossibly still. No Weishao de toe boo movements from breathing, no shifting to get comfortable, no fidgeting or checking mirrors. His face remained hidden beneath that heavy hood, but his hands on the wheel looked wrong somehow. The skin had a grayish tint, even accounting for the poor camera quality, and the fingers seemed too rigid, like they'd been frozen in place. I recorded everything, my pulse hammering as I watched him sit there for exactly 10 minutes. Then, right on schedule, the reverse lights came on. But this time, instead of backing straight out, the truck turned slightly, and for just a second, the driver's side faced directly toward the camera. The hood fell back just enough for me to glimpse his face, and what I saw sent me stumbling backward into the cigarette display. The features were human but wrong. Sunken eyes that didn't reflect any light, skin that looked like old leather, and an expression of complete emptiness. No recognition, no emotion, nothing that suggested a living person sat behind that wheel. The truck vanished into the night before I could recover my composure. I spent the next hour replaying the footage, trying to convince myself I'd misunderstood what I'd seen, that the poor lighting and old camera had played tricks on me. But each viewing only confirmed my initial impression. Whoever or whatever sat in that truck wasn't right. I saved multiple copies of the recording and started digging through the station's old logbooks, going back months, then years. Eugene kept meticulous records in a storage closet behind the break room, dusty binders filled with delivery schedules, maintenance reports, and incident logs dating back to the station's opening in 1987. That's when I found the first mention. December 1993. A note about a customer complaint regarding an abandoned vehicle at Pump 4 during the 2 a.m. hour. The description matched perfectly. Blue Chevy pickup, lone male driver, never exits the vehicle. The entries appeared sporadically after that. Always on Wednesdays, always during winter storms, always at exactly 2 a.m. The real shock came when I found a folder labeled Incident Reports, Law Enforcement, tucked behind the older logs. Inside were photocopied police reports, missing person flyers, and newspaper clippings. One caught my attention immediately. An article from January 1992 about a local man named Walter Hendricks who'd disappeared during a severe blizzard. He'd been driving home from his job at a mining camp when his truck, a blue 1988 Chevy Silverado, vanished somewhere along the Dalton Highway. Search parties found no trace of him or the vehicle, despite extensive efforts. The article included a photo of Walter, and even in the grainy newspaper reproduction, I recognized those sunken features. But it was the last document in the folder that made me drop everything and reach for my phone. Someone had run the truck's license plate 2 years ago and attached the results. The plate belonged to Walter Hendricks, and according to DMV records, it had been registered to a vehicle declared missing in January 1992, over 30 years ago. I tried calling Eugene, but his phone went straight to voicemail. The next Wednesday loomed just 2 days away, and I couldn't decide whether to quit immediately or stay to confront whatever kept returning to Pump 4. Curiosity won out, along with a strange sense of obligation, like I needed to understand this for Walter's sake, wherever he really was. I spent those 2 days researching everything I could find about the disappearance. Walter had been 28 when he vanished, worked rotating shifts at the Red Dog mine, and left behind a wife and infant daughter. The search efforts had been hampered by the blizzard that night, with visibility near zero and temperatures dropping to 40 below. One detail from the police report stood out. Walter's last radio contact with the mining camp mentioned stopping for gas, though he never specified where. The timeline would have put him near mile 237 around 2 a.m., right when the storm hit its peak. I also discovered something else in the newspaper archives. 3 other people had gone missing along that stretch of highway over the years, all during winter storms, all late at night. None of them were ever found. Wednesday arrived with clear skies for once, stars visible through the station windows and the temperature hovering around -20. I'd convinced myself that maybe the clear weather would break the pattern, that whatever brought Walter's truck back only came with the storms. But at 1:45 a.m., clouds rolled in from nowhere, bringing snow that fell in thick, heavy sheets. By 1:55, visibility had dropped to almost nothing, and I knew he'd come. I'd prepared everything: fresh batteries in my flashlight, my phone fully charged, Eugene's number on speed dial, and a baseball bat from the storage room tucked behind the counter. At exactly 2 a.m., those familiar headlights pierced through the snow. The blue Chevy rolled up to Pump 4 with that same mechanical precision, and Walter, or the thing that used to be Walter, sat behind the wheel in his eternal vigil. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed the flashlight and bat, took a deep breath, and pushed out into the storm. The cold hit like a physical force, stealing my breath and making my eyes water instantly. Snow swirled in chaotic patterns, reducing the world to a white void broken only by the dim glow of the station lights and the idling truck. As I approached Pump 4, fighting against the wind with every step, I noticed something that hadn't been visible on the cameras. The snow around the truck fell differently, creating a perfect circle where not a single flake touched the vehicle. Even stranger, the windows showed no fog from breathing, no condensation from body heat. The interior looked as cold as the air outside. I reached the driver's side door, my flashlight beam catching that terrible face in profile. Up close, Walter's features were even more disturbing. Skin like old parchment stretched over bone, eyes that were open but saw nothing, lips slightly parted as if frozen mid-word. I raised my hand to knock on the window, and that's when everything went sideways. The moment my knuckles made contact with the glass, the station's power cut out completely. The pumps went dark. The building behind me vanished into blackness, and even my flashlight flickered and died. In that sudden darkness, I heard the truck's door creak open for the first time. The emergency generator should have kicked in within seconds, but the darkness stretched on. I stumbled backward, swinging the bat blindly while trying to restart my flashlight with numb fingers. Then, impossibly, I saw light coming from inside the station. Not the harsh fluorescence, but a soft, pale glow emanating from the windows. Through the snow, I could make out a figure standing inside, perfectly still, facing outward. The proportions were wrong, too tall and too thin, but I recognized the heavy winter coat and the hollow face. Walter stood inside the locked station, on the wrong side of the front window, staring out at me. Frost spread across the glass from where he stood, forming intricate patterns that crept outward like frozen veins. The really horrifying part was that I could still hear the truck idling behind me, engine running smooth and steady. I turned my head just enough to confirm what I already knew. The driver's seat was empty, the door hanging open like a mouth. When I looked back at the station, Walter had moved closer to the glass, close enough that I could see every detail of his ruined face, those empty eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my chest tight with panic. The sound that came next will haunt me forever. A voice like wind through a frozen pipe, muffled by the glass but clear enough to understand. Still, looking for pump 4. Each word came out slow and labored, accompanied by more frost spreading across the window, until the entire storefront was white with ice. I backed away, slipping on the snow-covered ground, the bat useless in my shaking grip. Behind me, the truck's engine suddenly revved, headlights flashing in a rhythm that seemed almost like Morse code. The pale glow inside the station began to pulse in sync with the lights, and I realized with growing horror that Walter wasn't alone in there. Shadows moved behind him, other figures in winter gear all standing at the windows now. 4 of them total, including Walter, matching the number of missing persons I'd read about. They all stared out with those same empty eyes, mouths moving in unison to form words I couldn't hear over the storm. The frost on the windows began forming letters spelled out in ice. "Help us find the way." I ran. Not back to the truck, not to the highway, but around the building to the employee entrance, fumbling with my keys while those dead eyes tracked my movement through every window. The door finally gave way and I burst inside, slamming it behind me and throwing the deadbolt. The emergency lights suddenly blazed to life, revealing an empty store. No figures at the windows, no frost on the glass. Everything normal except for the thundering of my own heartbeat. But the truck was still out there. I could hear it idling at pump 4. I called 911 with trembling fingers, babbling about intruders and power outages, anything to get someone else there. While waiting, I grabbed the USB drive with the footage and stuffed it in my pocket, then noticed something that made me sick. The clock on the wall showed 2:47 a.m., but according to my phone, only 10 minutes had passed since the power went out. The responding officer found nothing. No truck, no footprints except mine. No frost damage to the windows. The next morning I gave Eugene my resignation, packed my things and left Alaska entirely. But sometimes, on winter nights when the snow falls heavy, I still dream about Pump 4 and those words traced in ice. I never found out what they were looking for, and honestly, I hope I never do. October 2019 was when everything changed between me and my dad. We'd planned this moose hunt up in Alaska's Copper River Basin for months, our first real father-son trip since I'd moved to Seattle for work 3 years earlier. I'm 28, do IT consulting, and honestly hadn't spent more than a weekend with the old man since college. He'd been hunting that region for over 2 decades, knew every ridge and creek like they were extensions of his own backyard. We drove up from Anchorage in his trusty Chevy Silverado, rifles secured, camping gear packed tight, both of us genuinely excited about disconnecting from the world for 5 straight days. The plan seemed straightforward: track some moose, maybe get lucky with a clean shot, and just enjoy the wilderness without cell towers or work emails buzzing in our pockets. The first day unfolded exactly as we'd hoped. We hiked roughly 6 miles from our parking spot, found a solid campsite near this narrow creek that cut through a valley surrounded by dense spruce and birch. Dad had that confident swagger he always got in the woods, pointing out animal signs, explaining wind patterns, sharing stories about previous hunts in the area. The weather was crisp but not brutal, maybe 35 degrees with clear skies and that perfect autumn light filtering through the trees. We set up our tent, organized our gear, and spent the evening planning our route for the next morning while sharing a thermos of coffee spiked with whiskey. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. We were both tired from the hike, talking quietly about family stuff, work stress, life in general. Neither of us had any idea that we were already being watched. The weirdness started on day 2. We'd been hiking for about 3 hours, following this game trail that wound up through a series of rocky outcrops, when Dad stopped dead in his tracks. He was staring at something about 30 yards ahead, his expression shifting from casual interest to genuine confusion. When I caught up to him, I saw what had grabbed his attention, scattered pieces of what used to be a caribou, but not like any kill I'd ever seen before. The bones were picked completely clean, almost surgically precise, but the strange part was how the pieces were arranged. They weren't just randomly scattered like a normal predator kill would be. Instead, they formed this weird pattern, almost like they'd been deliberately placed in a rough circle around a flat boulder. The skull sat right in the center, empty sockets staring up at the gray sky, and the larger bones radiated outward like spokes on a wheel. Dad knelt down next to the remains, running his fingers along the clean bone edges. He'd been hunting for over 20 years, seen plenty of bear kills, wolf packs feeding, even mountain lion attacks. But this was different. The bones were too clean, too organized, and there wasn't a single track anywhere in the soft earth around the site. Not even a partial paw print or scuff mark. "Kevin," he said quietly, using my full name, which he only did when he was seriously concerned. "I've never seen anything like this. Whatever did this, it's big enough to take down a full-grown caribou, but smart enough to not leave any evidence behind." We spent another 10 minutes examining the area, circling wider and wider, but found absolutely nothing. No fur, no blood trail, no disturbance in the surrounding vegetation. It was like the animal had just materialized, arranged these bones with surgical precision, then vanished into thin air. We tried to shake it off and continued our hunt, but the discovery had clearly rattled both of us. Dad kept glancing back toward the bone site, and I caught myself scanning the tree line more frequently than usual. About 2 miles further up the trail, we found another kill, this time a ptarmigan, but again the remains were arranged in that same unnatural pattern. The small bones formed a perfect miniature circle around a smooth river stone, with the tiny skull positioned exactly in the center. What made it even more disturbing was that ptarmigans are ground birds, easy prey for foxes or hawks, but there were no feathers scattered around, no signs of a struggle, nothing that would indicate a normal predator-prey encounter. Dad picked up one of the delicate wing bones and held it up to the light, showing me how cleanly it had been stripped of meat. "This is surgical work," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "No animal does this kind of precision cleaning naturally." The pattern continued throughout the day. We found 5 more kill sites, each one more unsettling than the last. A ground squirrel arranged around a piece of quartz, a marten's bones forming a perfect circle around a flat piece of shale. Each site was immaculate, sterile almost, with that same eerie precision that made the hair on my arms stand up. What really got to me was the escalation. The kills were getting fresher as we moved deeper into the basin. The first caribou had been there for days, maybe weeks, but the last few sites still had that metallic smell of recent death clinging to them. Dad started walking differently, keeping his rifle ready, constantly checking behind us. Neither of us wanted to admit it out loud, but we both knew something was tracking our movements, staying just far enough ahead to prepare these grotesque displays for us to find. It was like we were being led deeper into its territory, following a trail of increasingly fresh kills that served as both warning and invitation. That night, we made camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick spruce trees, both of us too on edge to venture further. Dad insisted we keep the fire burning all night, taking turns on watch even though we'd never done that on previous camping trips. I drew the first shift, sitting with my back against a fallen log, rifle across my lap, listening to every snap of branches and rustle of leaves in the darkness beyond our firelight. Around 2 a.m. during Dad's watch, I woke up to the sound of him whispering my name urgently. When I opened my eyes, he was pointing toward the opposite side of the clearing, his face pale in the flickering orange glow. "There," he breathed, "between those two big spruces. Don't move too fast, but tell me what you see." I turned my head slowly, following his gaze, and that's when I saw them. Two enormous yellow eyes reflecting our firelight, positioned about 8 feet off the ground, completely motionless. They weren't the typical green eyeshine you'd expect from a deer or moose, but this intense, almost golden color that seemed to pulse with intelligence. The eyes watched us for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. They never blinked, never moved, just maintained that steady, calculating stare that made my skin crawl. Dad had his rifle trained on the spot, but neither of us could make out any body shape or outline in the darkness behind those eyes. Whatever was watching us was massive. The eye placement alone suggested something significantly larger than any wolf or bear I'd ever encountered. The strangest part was how absolutely silent it was. No breathing sounds, no movement of vegetation, no shifting of weight from one foot to another. Just those unblinking eyes studying us with what felt like predatory patience. When dawn finally started to break and the first gray light began filtering through the trees, the eyes simply vanished. One moment they were there, the next they were gone, as if they'd never existed at all. We searched the area thoroughly once we had enough light, but found no tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no physical evidence that anything had been there. Day 3 changed everything. We'd been hiking for about 4 hours, both of us jumpy and exhausted from the sleepless night, when we reached the ridgeline overlooking the main valley. Dad was using his binoculars to scan for moose sign when he suddenly went completely rigid. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, handing me the binoculars with shaking fingers. "Tell me I'm not losing my mind." I adjusted the focus and looked where he was pointing, and there it was. Standing on the opposite ridge, maybe 800 yards away, was the largest wolf I'd ever seen, but calling it a wolf doesn't really do it justice. This thing was enormous, easily the size of a small horse, with a massive head and shoulders that seemed too broad for any normal canine. Its fur was almost black, except for these weird silver markings along its spine that caught the sunlight like metal. What made my heart race was the way it was standing, completely still, facing directly toward us, like it had been waiting for us to reach that exact spot. The wolf stood there for maybe 2 minutes, just watching us through what must have been its own incredible vision. Even at that distance, I could feel the weight of its attention, like it was cataloging every detail of our appearance and behavior. Dad was fumbling with his rifle, trying to get a clear shot, but the range was too far for any reliable accuracy. Then, without any warning or gradual movement, the wolf turned and began walking along the ridgeline with this fluid, almost flowing gait that didn't look natural. It moved like liquid shadow, covering ground impossibly fast while maintaining perfect balance on terrain that would challenge even an experienced mountain climber. What terrified me most was how it would stop every 100 yards or so, turn back toward us, and wait just long enough for us to track its movement before continuing. It was clearly demonstrating that it could outmaneuver us effortlessly, that it had been controlling this entire encounter from the beginning. That's when everything clicked into place for me. The bone arrangements, the fresh kills getting progressively newer as we moved deeper into the basin, the silent nighttime surveillance, and now this calculated display of dominance. We weren't hunting in its territory. We were being hunted by it. This wasn't some random predator protecting its domain. This was something far more intelligent and deliberate. The wolf had been shadowing us for the entire trip, staying just close enough to monitor our movements, while leaving those grotesque calling cards to announce its presence. Dad must have reached the same conclusion because he grabbed my arm and said, "We're leaving. Right now. This thing has been playing with us." We packed up our gear with frantic efficiency, abandoning any pretense of continuing the hunt. As we started our descent back toward the valley, I couldn't resist one last look through the binoculars. The wolf was still there, sitting now like some ancient sentinel, watching our retreat with what I swear looked like satisfaction. The hike back to our truck took us 6 hours of non-stop walking, both of us constantly checking the ridge lines and tree lines around us. We didn't speak much during the descent, but I could tell Dad was processing the same unsettling realization that was eating at me. That massive wolf had been orchestrating our entire experience from day one. Every kill site, every strange arrangement of bones, every moment of growing unease had been carefully planned to guide us deeper into its domain until it was ready to reveal itself. When we finally reached the Silverado, Dad threw our gear into the bed with shaking hands and started the engine before I'd even closed my door. As we drove away, I watched the wilderness disappear in the side mirror, and I swear I could still feel those golden eyes tracking our movement. We never went back to that area, and Dad sold his hunting gear the following spring. Neither of us ever talked about what we'd experienced, but I know we both understood that we'd encountered something that shouldn't exist. An apex predator with intelligence that bordered on supernatural, and we'd been incredibly lucky to leave its territory alive. The Caribou Migration Project seemed like the perfect opportunity to advance my career as a wildlife biologist. After 6 years of smaller research assignments, I finally had the chance to lead a team studying how climate change was disrupting traditional migration routes near the Yukon River. The assignment came through in late April 2017, and within 2 weeks, I was heading into the Canadian wilderness with a 5-person research team. We were tasked with monitoring 43 GPS-collared caribou over 3 weeks, documenting their movements and behavior patterns. The data we collected would potentially influence conservation policies across the region, making this one of the most important projects I'd ever been involved in. I remember feeling this mixture of excitement and responsibility as we loaded our gear: thermal drones, tracking equipment, camping supplies for an extended stay in some seriously remote territory. Our base camp was established at an old logging site that had been abandoned sometime in the 1980s. The location was ideal for our research purposes: flat ground for equipment setup, close proximity to the river for water access, and positioned directly along one of the main caribou migration corridors. But the place had this unsettling atmosphere that I couldn't quite shake. Rusted machinery sat half-buried under decades of moss and fallen leaves, while rotting wooden structures slowly surrendered to the encroaching forest. My team consisted of Dr. James Mitchell, our experienced project leader, Lisa Chen from the university's wildlife department, and 2 graduate students named Alex and Maria. We'd collaborated on previous assignments, so there was an established workflow to how we organized our campsite, distributed daily responsibilities, and settled into our research routine. The first few days proceeded exactly according to plan, with clear, consistent GPS signals streaming in from all tagged animals. The work itself was methodical and rewarding. Every morning, we'd check our tracking systems while drinking coffee around the portable camp stove, watching dozens of red dots move across our digital maps. The caribou were following their expected routes, clustering in feeding areas during the day and moving steadily northward each night. Lisa handled the thermal drone flights, capturing behavioral footage that would complement our GPS data. Alex and Maria took turns monitoring the radio frequencies, while Dr. Mitchell and I analyzed movement patterns and updated our field notes. The weather held steady: cool mornings, warm afternoons, and crystal clear nights perfect for equipment operation. By day 5, we documented some fascinating deviations from historical migration patterns. Exactly the kind of data that would make our research valuable. The routine was comfortable, predictable, and everything was going according to our carefully planned schedule. During those first several days, I started noticing small details about the abandoned logging site that hadn't been immediately apparent. There were these perfectly straight cut marks on certain trees, far too precise to be natural, suggesting the loggers had used some kind of advanced equipment for their time. The concrete foundations of demolished buildings formed geometric patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like whoever had designed the original layout had some specific organizational system in mind. Most intriguingly, we found several metal plates buried under decades of debris, each one stamped with sequential numbers but no company identification or dates. Dr. Mitchell mentioned that logging operations from that era typically left more obvious traces: marked trees, equipment serial numbers, proper signage. But this place was different, almost sterile in how thoroughly it had been cleared of identifying information. Still, it didn't interfere with our research, and we had more pressing concerns than investigating the site's mysterious past. Everything changed on the night of May 15th. I was reviewing data logs in my tent around 11:30 p.m. when Alex came running from the monitoring station, his face pale in the lantern light. "Heather, you need to see this right now," he said, his voice tight with concern. All 43 GPS signals had disappeared simultaneously at exactly 11:17 p.m. Not gradually, not one by one, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The tracking system showed no error messages, no equipment malfunctions, no technical explanations for the sudden blackout. Lisa ran diagnostics on our receivers while Dr. Mitchell checked the backup systems, but everything on our end was functioning perfectly. We spent the next 3 hours trying to re-establish contact, adjusting frequencies, boosting signal strength, even attempting manual pings to individual callers. Nothing worked. The caribou had simply vanished from our monitoring network, leaving us staring at empty screens and wondering what the hell had just happened. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in the wilderness. Usually, the Canadian forest at night is alive with sounds: owls calling, branches creaking, small animals rustling through undergrowth. But after the signals disappeared, even those familiar noises seemed to fade away, replaced by an oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. We decided to take shifts monitoring the equipment through the night, hoping the signals might return as mysteriously as they'd vanished. Dr. Mitchell took the first watch, followed by Lisa, then Alex. When my turn came at 4 a.m., I sat alone in the monitoring tent, surrounded by silent equipment and trying to make sense of what had happened. The GPS system had never failed so completely before, and the timing, all signals cutting out at the exact same moment, suggested something far more serious than a simple technical glitch. I kept checking and rechecking our data logs, hoping to find some pattern or explanation that we'd missed. Dawn brought no relief, just more questions. We packed up quickly and headed out to the last known location of the nearest caribou herd, about 6 miles northeast of our camp. The hike through dense forest was tense, everyone lost in their own thoughts about what we might find. When we reached the area, there was no sign of the animals, no tracks, no droppings, no evidence they'd ever been there. But our equipment was undisturbed, sitting exactly where we'd left it the previous day. Cameras, motion sensors, even the backup GPS units were all functioning normally, still recording data from their positions. It was as if the caribou had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the technology we'd used to monitor them. Lisa suggested we expand our search radius, but Dr. Mitchell was already looking worried about our timeline and resources. We spent the entire day searching a 12-mile area, finding nothing but empty wilderness and the growing certainty that something unprecedented had occurred. That evening, Lisa decided to review the thermal drone footage from the previous night, hoping to find some clue about what had happened to the caribou. We gathered around her laptop in the main tent, watching hours of grainy infrared video. Most of it showed exactly what we expected: empty forest, occasional small animals moving through the underbrush, the normal thermal signatures of a quiet wilderness night. But at 11:15 p.m., just 2 minutes before the GPS signals disappeared, the footage captured something extraordinary. 7 tall figures emerged from the tree line, moving in perfect synchronization across the open area near our camp. They were definitely humanoid, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too coordinated, moving with a fluid precision that seemed almost mechanical. The thermal signatures showed they were warmer than the surrounding environment, but cooler than normal human body temperature. Most disturbing was how they moved together, like a single organism with multiple parts, maintaining exact spacing and identical movements as they crossed the frame and disappeared back into the forest on the opposite side. None of us spoke for several minutes after the footage ended. Dr. Mitchell rewound it 3 times, studying every detail, while Alex kept muttering that the equipment must have malfunctioned. But Lisa and I both knew what we were seeing was real. The thermal imaging was too consistent, too detailed to be some kind of technical glitch. The figures were approximately 8 feet tall, with elongated limbs and movements that suggested they were intimately familiar with the terrain. They made no sound that the drone's audio equipment could detect, moving across fallen logs and dense undergrowth without disturbing a single branch. What haunted me most was their coordination, not just walking in formation, but actually mirroring each other's movements down to the smallest gesture. When the lead figure raised what appeared to be its arm, all 7 performed the identical motion simultaneously. We watched the clip dozens of times, but it only raised more questions about what we were dealing with and whether it was connected to the caribou disappearance. That night, we implemented a buddy system. No one was allowed to leave their tent alone, and we established regular check-ins every hour until dawn. Despite our precautions, I barely slept, listening to every sound outside and wondering if those figures were still out there, watching us. Around 3 a.m., I heard Maria whispering urgently to Alex in the tent next to mine, but when I called out to ask if everything was okay, she said she'd just had a bad dream. The rest of the night passed without incident, but morning brought a new horror that made the previous day's mysteries seem trivial. When we gathered for breakfast at 7 a.m., Alex was missing. His sleeping bag was empty, his personal belongings still neatly arranged beside his cot, and his boots were gone. We searched the immediate area around camp, calling his name and checking all the places he might have wandered during the night. Dr. Mitchell was already talking about contacting emergency services when I decided to check the riverbank, thinking maybe Alex had gone for water and slipped on the muddy slope. What I found at the water's edge defied every logical explanation I could think of. Alex's hiking boots were placed with mathematical precision on a flat rock, positioned perfectly parallel to each other and facing directly toward the flowing water. The laces were tied in neat bows, exactly as he always wore them, and there wasn't a single scuff mark or piece of mud on the leather. But there were no footprints, not leading to the boots, not leading away from them, nothing in the soft riverbank soil that would indicate how they'd gotten there. The rock they sat on was completely dry, despite the morning mist that had dampened everything else in the area. I called the others over, and we spent 2 hours examining every inch of the surrounding ground, looking for any trace of Alex's passage. The absence of tracks was absolute and impossible. Even if someone had deliberately erased footprints, there would be signs of the erasure itself. Yet the boots sat there like a carefully arranged display, as if they'd been placed by someone who could move without touching the ground. We packed up camp immediately and hiked back to the nearest communication point to contact the authorities. The search and rescue operation lasted 4 days, involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and experienced wilderness teams, but no trace of Alex was ever found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, with the working theory being that he'd somehow fallen into the river and been swept away by the current. But that explanation didn't account for the boots, which the investigators dismissed as irrelevant details. 6 months later, I received a call from a forestry worker who'd been conducting surveys in the same area. He'd found something buried under a pile of stones near the old logging site. A GPS collar, still functional, with data showing it had been stationary in that exact location since May 15th at 11:17 p.m. It was one of the collars from our missing caribou, and the timing matched perfectly with when all the signals had disappeared. I never went back to that site, and I've never worked another research project in that region. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Every time someone mentions Alaska, my stomach twists into knots. People always picture the beautiful wilderness and amazing northern lights, but all I can think about is that night at Copper Creek Lodge. At the time, I was fresh out of my junior year at college, taking a seasonal job as a front desk clerk and maintenance helper at this tiny remote lodge near Wrangell St. Elias National Park. It was June 2022, and the place was basically my entire world for 3 months. The lodge had 12 small cabins scattered around the property, connected by gravel paths that crunched under your feet no matter how quietly you tried to walk. Our nearest neighbor was 40 miles away, and cell service was absolutely non-existent. The only connection to the outside world was a single landline in the main office that crackled with static on good days. Most nights, the silence was so complete, it felt like we were the only people left on Earth. The guests that week were mostly hikers and photographers, the kind of people who came to Alaska specifically to get away from civilization. There was this couple, David and Amanda, who'd been staying in cabin 7 for 3 days with their friend Troy. David was one of those guys who never seemed to stop talking, always cracking jokes and making everyone laugh during meals in the main lodge. Amanda was quieter, more reserved, but she had this way of watching everything around her like she was constantly taking mental notes. Troy was somewhere in between, friendly enough, but kept to himself most of the time. They'd spend their days hiking the trails around the property and come back every evening completely exhausted, covered in mud and mosquito bites. The dynamic between them seemed normal enough, just 3 friends on a wilderness adventure, but there was this underlying tension I couldn't quite put my finger on, especially between David and Troy. The day everything went wrong started like any other. I'd spent most of it fixing a broken water heater in cabin 3 and restocking supplies in the main lodge. The weather had been unusually warm for June, and by evening the air was thick with mosquitoes and that strange twilight that never quite turns to full darkness during Alaskan summers. Around 9 p.m., I noticed David, Amanda, and Troy heading toward the bathhouse, which was this small wooden building about 100 yards from the main lodge. Troy was carrying a towel and seemed eager to finally get cleaned up after their long hike. David and Amanda were walking behind him, and I could hear David's voice getting louder as they got farther away, though I couldn't make out what he was saying. There was something about his tone that made me pause while I was locking up the office, but I shrugged it off. Guests argued sometimes, especially when they were tired and dealing with the isolation. About an hour later, I was in my small staff cabin reading when I heard voices outside. At first, I thought it was just other guests coming back from the evening activities, but the voices were getting closer and more agitated. Then I heard Amanda's voice, sharp and panicked, calling out something about Troy being missing. I put down my book and listened more carefully. David was with her, and they were moving from cabin to cabin, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen Troy. Their voices had this frantic edge that made the hair on my arms stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, and that's when Amanda spotted me. She came running over, her face pale even in the dim light, and David was right behind her with this wild look in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Amanda kept saying Troy had disappeared after some kind of fight near the bathhouse, but when I asked for details, both of them seemed to stumble over their words. The story they told me kept changing every time I asked a question. First, Amanda said Troy had gotten into an argument with a stranger who was lurking around the bathhouse. Then David jumped in and said the stranger had been there for hours, just watching people come and go. But when I asked what this stranger looked like, Amanda described a tall man with dark hair, while David insisted he was shorter with a beard. Their descriptions were so different it was like they were talking about completely different people. Amanda kept wringing her hands and looking around nervously, while David was pacing back and forth, running his fingers through his hair repeatedly. The whole situation felt wrong, like they were performing some kind of rehearsed panic rather than genuinely worried about their friend. I told them we should check the bathhouse first, and maybe Troy had just wandered off to cool down after whatever argument had happened. But as we walked toward the building, I noticed David kept glancing at Amanda with these quick, meaningful looks that made my skin crawl. The bathhouse was completely empty when we got there, but there were clear signs of some kind of struggle. The wooden bench outside was overturned, and there were scuff marks in the dirt that looked like someone had been dragged or had fallen hard. Amanda immediately started crying and saying they needed to call the police, but when I suggested we use the landline in the main office, David quickly said we should search the property first. He insisted that Troy probably just went for a walk to clear his head and would be back any minute. But the way he said it, with this forced calm in his voice, made me realize he was trying to control the situation. I agreed to help them search, but I was already planning to call the authorities as soon as we got back to the lodge. The three of us spent the next hour combing through the trails with flashlights, calling Troy's name and getting no response. Every shadow seemed threatening, and every sound made us jump. Amanda kept asking what we were going to do, but David kept steering the conversation away from calling for help. When we finally gave up the search around midnight, I was exhausted and genuinely worried about Troy. I told David and Amanda that I was going to call the state troopers from the main office, and that's when David's whole demeanor changed. He grabbed my arm and said we should wait until morning, that Troy would probably show up on his own and we'd just be wasting everyone's time. But Amanda disagreed, saying they needed to call Troy's family and let them know what was happening. The two of them started arguing right there in front of me, and I could hear the desperation in both their voices. David kept insisting that calling the police would just make things worse, while Amanda was practically begging him to let me make the call. During their argument, I noticed David had scratches on his forearms that definitely weren't there earlier in the day, and when I asked him about them, he claimed he'd gotten them while pushing through some bushes during our search. But the scratches looked fresh and deep, like fingernail marks, and they were in a pattern that made me think of someone trying to defend themselves. I finally convinced them that we needed to contact the authorities, and the three of us walked back to the main lodge together. The building felt eerily quiet as I unlocked the office door, and I could hear both David and Amanda breathing heavily behind me. When I picked up the landline phone to dial, there was no dial tone, just complete silence. I jiggled the cord and checked all the connections, but the line was completely dead. David immediately said the phone lines probably went down because of the weather, but there hadn't been any storms that day. Amanda was getting more agitated by the minute, pacing around the small office and muttering about how they needed to get help somehow. I told them I'd drive to the nearest town in the morning to report Troy missing, but David quickly volunteered to go instead. He said he knew the area better and could get there faster, but something about his eagerness to leave made me suspicious. I insisted that we all stay together until we figured out what had happened to Troy, and that's when I noticed David and Amanda exchange another one of those loaded glances. We decided to wait until dawn before making any decisions, and I offered to let them stay in the main lodge instead of going back to their cabin. Amanda accepted immediately, but David seemed reluctant, saying he wanted to go back and get some of their things. I watched him walk toward cabin 7, and something about the way he moved, quick and purposeful, made me decide to follow him at a distance. I grabbed my flashlight and snuck out the back door of the lodge, staying in the shadows as I made my way toward their cabin. David went inside for maybe 10 minutes, and when he came out, he was carrying a large duffel bag that looked much heavier than it should have if he was just getting clothes. He also had something wrapped in a towel tucked under his arm, and he kept looking around nervously as he walked back. I managed to get back to the lodge before him, but I pretended to be dozing in one of the lobby chairs when he returned. Amanda was curled up on the couch, but I could tell she wasn't really sleeping either. The three of us spent the rest of the night in that main room, and I don't think any of us got a minute of real sleep. When the sun finally came up around 4:30 a.m., I suggested we all walk back to the bathhouse area in the daylight to see if we could find any more clues about what happened to Troy. David immediately protested, saying we'd already searched thoroughly and wouldn't find anything new. But Amanda stood up and said she wanted to look again, and after a moment of hesitation, David agreed to come with us. As we walked toward the bathhouse, I noticed David kept positioning himself between Amanda and me, like he was trying to control what we could see or where we could go. The morning light revealed details we'd missed in the dark. There were drops of what looked like dried liquid on the wooden steps of the bathhouse, and the ground around the building was more disturbed than I'd initially realized. Amanda pointed out a torn piece of fabric caught on a nearby bush, and when she started to reach for it, David quickly stepped in and said we shouldn't touch anything that might be evidence. But the way he said it, with this forced authority in his voice, made me wonder if he was trying to preserve evidence or destroy it. Around 7 a.m., I heard the distant sound of a helicopter approaching, which was unusual since we rarely got air traffic that early in the morning. David's face went completely white when he heard it, and he started talking rapidly about how they should probably head back to their cabin to pack up and leave. But Amanda was staring at the helicopter with this expression of relief mixed with terror, and she whispered something about hoping it was help. The helicopter landed in the clearing near the main lodge, and 2 state troopers got out along with a paramedic. My first thought was that someone else had called about Troy, but then I realized that was impossible, since our phone lines were down. One of the troopers approached us and asked if we were the people who'd reported a missing person, and before I could answer, David jumped in and said there had been a misunderstanding. He claimed Troy had just wandered off for a walk and had probably already made it back to town on his own. The trooper looked skeptical and asked to speak with each of us separately, starting with Amanda. While Amanda was talking to the officers, David kept trying to convince me that we should tell them everything was fine and that Troy would turn up eventually. He was sweating despite the cool morning air, and he kept fidgeting with something in his pocket. But then the paramedic came over and told us they'd found Troy about 2 miles downstream, near the old mining road. He was alive but in critical condition with multiple stab wounds, and they'd already airlifted him to a hospital in Fairbanks. The paramedic said Troy had managed to crawl to the road and flag down a passing truck driver who'd called for help on his CB radio. When I looked at David after hearing this news, his face had gone completely gray, and he was staring at the ground like he was trying to disappear. Amanda started crying, but they weren't tears of relief. They were tears of fear. The troopers arrested David that afternoon after finding the knife wrapped in the towel he'd retrieved from their cabin, and Amanda confessed that she'd helped him move Troy's body after the attack. She said David had snapped during an argument about money Troy owed him, and they'd panicked when they thought he was dead. The phone line had been cut with wire cutters found in David's bag. Amanda got a reduced sentence for cooperating, but David was charged with attempted murder. I quit my job the next day and never went back to Alaska. Sometimes I still wake up wondering what would have happened if that truck driver hadn't found Troy in time. Most summers, my Uncle Tim would take me out fishing somewhere remote in Alaska. He's the kind of guy who thinks Wi-Fi is a government trick, and that real life starts when your boots hit mud. That particular trip, we were camped just outside Bethel, along a bend in the Kuskokwim River where the bank slopes down in a jagged mess of roots and packed silt. I'd just turned 13 that spring, and it was my first time getting my own gear, rod, boots, even a small fillet knife. I remember feeling proud, like I'd finally earned a spot alongside the grown-ups, even if I still had to sleep in the smaller tent. It was early afternoon and Tim had hiked up river a ways to check some traps, leaving me with instructions not to wander far and to keep the fire going. The sun was out but hazy, filtered through low clouds that made everything look softer, quieter. I'd set up by the water with my tackle box and a half-warmed thermos of black coffee I wasn't really supposed to be drinking. The current was slow that day, dragging bits of moss and drift in wide arcs, and I remember watching the surface like it was a movie. No phone, no distractions, just that steady hush of water and wind. Then someone called out from the trees behind me. At first, I thought it was Tim messing with me. The voice had that friendly but strained tone, like someone trying not to spook a stray dog. When I turned, I saw a man standing halfway down the slope leading into the brush. He had on this camo jacket that looked like it had been dipped in mud and forgotten for years, and a wool beanie stretched over his head like he'd pulled it on without checking if it fit. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't from the campgrounds or from the small shop we stopped at in town. He smiled with his mouth open just enough to show a missing canine tooth and said he was a local guide. Claimed he was moving gear for a group of hunters and needed a second pair of hands. There was something about how still he stood while talking that didn't sit right with me. His feet never shifted. His hands stayed behind his back even when he gestured with his chin toward the trees. I asked which outfitter he worked for, and he dodged the question like I'd asked for his social security number. Then he laughed, this dry, shallow sound, and said I looked strong enough to carry a couple crates. He pointed deeper into the woods, saying it wasn't far, just past a ridge. I remember feeling my knees tense, not with fear exactly, but like my body had already made a decision before my brain caught up. I told him I needed to grab my boots, stalling really, but he stepped forward like he hadn't heard me. Only a few feet, but it felt way too close. His boots sank into the soft dirt near the edge of the water, leaving deep, wide prints like he'd been pacing that shoreline for a while. That's when I noticed the back of his pants were soaked up to the thighs, and not from walking through shallow river water. It was darker, muddier, like he'd been kneeling somewhere wet for too long. He glanced toward the trail again, but there wasn't any gear in sight. Just thick brush and a mess of alder branches snapped low like someone had pushed through them fast and recently. I said no. I didn't even think about it. Just said it out loud, firm and clear, the way my uncle had told me to speak if something ever felt wrong. The man didn't respond right away. He just kept standing there, staring like I hadn't spoken at all. His face didn't change, but his jaw clenched once, quick. Then he sort of laughed through his nose and muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "They never learn." That's when I backed away, careful not to turn around, keeping the river behind me as a kind of barrier. I felt this weird pressure, like I had to keep talking or moving or doing something, because silence felt dangerous. I walked backward until I hit a log that marked the trail back to camp. That's when he took one more step toward me, slow, deliberate, and said, "You don't want to be out here alone when it gets dark." It wasn't a threat, not exactly. More like he was stating a fact. His tone was flat and weirdly calm, like he was reciting a weather report. I didn't answer, I just turned and ran. Didn't check if he followed. I didn't hear footsteps, but I also didn't trust the quiet. The trees seemed thicker on the way back, like they were leaning in, and I remember ducking under branches that hadn't been low before. By the time I reached the tents, I couldn't tell if I'd been gone 10 minutes or an hour. Everything looked the same, but it all felt off balance, like the world had been nudged slightly sideways. I didn't see Tim anywhere, and for a second I panicked, thinking maybe that man had gotten to him too. But then I saw smoke curling up from the fire pit. He came out from behind the truck a few seconds later, holding a wrench, wiping grease off his fingers. He asked if I'd caught anything. I told him no, and that we needed to pack up early. He gave me a look but didn't argue. We left that same afternoon. Tim didn't press for details until we were halfway down the gravel road back toward town. I told him what happened, as straight as I could. He got real quiet, not angry, just focused, like he was already mentally reviewing maps and faces. He asked what the man looked like, what he said, and if I could point out the exact spot. I told him about the soaked pants, the missing tooth, the part where he kept his hands out of view. Tim didn't speak for a while after that. When we got to town, he made a quick stop at the ranger station while I waited in the truck with the windows cracked and my fishing rod still in the back seat, untouched. That night, back at the motel, the news was on in the background while we were eating. I was barely paying attention until Tim turned the volume up. A missing persons alert had gone out. Boy named Alex, 15, last seen just outside a different campsite, not far from ours, 4 days earlier. No solid leads, but the report mentioned he was last spotted talking to someone described as a man in camouflage, possibly local. The photo of the missing kid hit hard. He was taller than me, but something about his expression felt familiar. Just a regular teen trying to enjoy the outdoors, probably didn't expect his afternoon to turn sideways. I didn't sleep much that night. Kept thinking about how fast things could have gone bad if I'd said yes, if I'd followed, if I'd hesitated even a second longer. It's not like I did anything heroic. I just listened to that part of myself that tenses up when something isn't quite right. I still think about that man's voice sometimes, how calm it was when he told me I didn't want to be alone out there. Not angry, not frustrated, just certain. Like he wasn't guessing how things would end. He already knew. We haven't gone back to that spot since. Tim said we'd stick to places closer to town for a while. I never saw the man again, and as far as I know, no one was ever arrested. The other boy, Alex, was never found. His name comes up sometimes in forums like this, and every time it does, I think about saying something, about reporting the interaction again. But the truth is, I've already said what I know. And maybe posting here now is just a way to remind anyone reading. Trust that gut feeling, even if it doesn't make sense in the moment, especially when it doesn't. I still don't know why I didn't turn around that day. Part of me thinks it was just denial. I didn't want to admit something was wrong. We were supposed to be heading to a wrestling tournament in Soldotna, just me and my son, Mason. He was 16, big into sports, always tossing his gym bag in the back seat like he owned the world. I'd taken the weekend off from the dental office, packed us both up, filled the tank at a Chevron near Kenai Spur Road, and figured we'd make good time before sunset. The drive down from our town was familiar. We'd done it twice before for other school events. I remember telling myself it would be a quiet ride, maybe even a chance for us to talk without distractions. We were about 30 minutes south of Sterling when I noticed the pickup. It had dark tinted windows and an older matte gray paint job. Nothing flashy, just enough to blend in. It slipped into my lane behind us somewhere past the last gas station. At first, I didn't think much of it. The highway's long and mostly empty, and vehicles stick together sometimes for miles. But this one stayed close. Too close. I checked the mirror more than once, expecting it to pass. It never did. I even nudged over to the right shoulder, slowing down enough to invite it around. Instead, the driver matched my speed exactly, keeping the same tight distance, almost like he was tethered to us. I pointed it out to Mason, trying not to sound nervous. He was looking at his phone but glanced up and muttered something like, "Creeper vibes." He wasn't wrong. I tested it again, sped up a little, then dropped to under the speed limit. The truck mirrored everything. I tapped the brakes twice, a trick my dad used to warn tailgaters. No change. I switched lanes for no reason, still behind us. It wasn't aggressive, just deliberate. That's what made it worse. There was no honking, no flashing lights, no engine revving. Just that constant pressure behind us like we were being herded somewhere. I didn't want to panic in front of Mason, but I felt this cold realization start to grow. This wasn't just someone zoning out on the highway. It was too late to turn back, and cell signal was weak in that stretch. I told Mason to open the Maps app and look for the nearest place to pull over that had lights, maybe a store or a rest area. We found a rest stop about 10 minutes ahead. It was barely marked on the map, just a faded icon, but it was better than staying in motion with this guy glued to our bumper. I stayed calm, or at least tried to. My knuckles were starting to ache from how tightly I was gripping the wheel. The rest stop wasn't what I hoped it would be. It was a gravel pull-off with one flickering street lamp, a rusted vending machine that probably hadn't worked since the early 2000s, and a single unmarked porta-potty tilted slightly in the mud. No cars. No people. Just wind moving through the trees and the dull hum of the nearby river. I slowed down and pulled in anyway, thinking if the truck passed us, I'd just wait a few minutes before getting back on the road. But it didn't pass. It followed us in. Slow, steady, and confident. I felt Mason sit up straight. I could tell he was trying to act unfazed, but I saw the way he held his breath. The truck didn't park next to us. It angled itself behind my car, cutting off the exit like it had rehearsed the move. I didn't recognize the model exactly, older Chevy or GMC, maybe late 90s, but there was something strange about the front grille. It looked homemade, reinforced, like someone had welded extra bars across it. My headlights reflected off the tinted windshield, but I couldn't see inside. No movement, no door opening, just the truck sitting there, engine still on, low idle rumbling through the quiet like a warning. I told Mason, "Don't get out," and grabbed my phone. No signal. Mason whispered that he was already recording. He'd flipped his camera around and angled it low against the dashboard, barely moving his hand. I didn't even have to ask. He just did it. Smart kid. I told him to keep filming no matter what. I was about to honk, just once, to maybe scare whoever it was or alert someone nearby, even though I doubted anyone would hear. But before I could, the driver's side door of the truck cracked open. Not all the way, just a few inches. Then it shut again. Nothing else. No one got out. I couldn't explain the move, but it felt calculated, like they were letting us know they were watching, deciding. That was the moment it stopped feeling like paranoia and started feeling like a trap. I didn't want to reverse into them, but we were boxed in. There was a steep ditch to the right and dense trees on the left. I kept thinking, if I drive forward over the grass, I might get stuck. So I just stayed there, engine running, doors locked. The truck crept forward an inch, just one, and I couldn't help it. I yelled, "What the hell do you want?" Mason grabbed my arm, trying to calm me down, and whispered, "Mom, wait." The driver still didn't move. Just that engine, humming like it had all the time in the world. Out of pure instinct, I leaned on the horn, long and loud. It echoed across the trees and the empty highway beyond. That finally did something. The truck jolted back, then reversed fast, kicking up gravel behind it. It didn't leave the lot entirely. It stopped again by the exit, halfway turned toward the road like the driver couldn't decide whether to flee or wait. I put the car in drive, aimed straight at the ditch, and floored it. The wheels bounced hard over the edge, the undercarriage scraped, but we made it through the muddy patch and onto the far side of the rest stop. I didn't look back until I was on the highway again. When I checked the mirror, the truck was gone. Not on the road behind us, not in the lot. Just vanished. Mason stopped recording, and we drove the next 20 minutes in silence until we hit a more populated area, and I could finally breathe again. I pulled into a busy grocery store parking lot and made him send the video to my email just in case. We sat there for a while before I called the police. I didn't even care if they thought I was being dramatic. I knew what we'd just experienced wasn't normal. It wasn't road rage, it wasn't a prank. It was something darker. The trooper who met us took it seriously. I showed him the footage, and he actually recognized the truck right away. He didn't give us the full story, but he said the driver matched the description of someone they'd been trying to locate for months, connected to at least 3 other roadside harassment reports along the Kenai Peninsula. Always late afternoons, always targeting women driving alone or with kids. Nothing had escalated to violence, but the behavior was escalating. He said Mason's video was the clearest evidence they had so far, and that it might finally give them what they needed to make an arrest. We never heard what happened after that. They didn't follow up, probably for legal reasons, but I've never driven that stretch of highway again, not without someone in the passenger seat and a full tank of gas. Mason stopped asking for solo drives too. He still jokes that he saved the day with his camera. And maybe he's right. That little bit of instinct might have kept us from becoming another case they never solved. I just hope whoever was behind that wheel, whoever thought that kind of thing was a game, realized they picked the wrong car that night.